closure without them is one of the hardest things I have ever had to understand. Because for a long time, I thought closure was something you got when the other person finally explained themselves, finally apologized, finally came back, clearly, finally said the thing that would make the whole story make sense. I thought closure lived in the conversation I never got, or the answer that came too late, or the moment where the pain would finally line up with logic and I could say, okay, now I can move on. What I learned instead is that sometimes it ends in reality long before it ends in your body. And that gap is where people get trapped. That gap is where you keep replaying, keep hoping, keep checking, keep waiting for the emotional ending to catch up to the actual one. Because your mind may know it is over, but your body still has not released the bond. Your body still reacts, still waits, still braces, still lights up at the thought of them, still collapses at reminders, still carries unfinished contact like it means something is still alive. That is the part I wish more people understood. Sometimes the reason you cannot get closure is not because you are weak, dramatic, obsessed, or refusing reality. Sometimes it is because your body is still living inside an attachment event that is not fully completed. And that is why I wanted this video to be about closure without them. Because a lot of people are waiting for closure from the exact person who helped create the injury in the first place. They are waiting for one more conversation, one more explanation, one more soft moment, one more emotionally satisfying ending. But what I finally learned is that closure often does not arrive as information. It arrives as regulation. It arrives when the body stops organizing itself around the bond. It arrives when the nervous system no longer treats the person as an active emotional event. It arrives when your body no longer feels like it is waiting for something unfinished to happen. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. One of the most painful things about ending a connection is that the body does not really care whether you have a good explanation. It cares whether the attachment has settled. That is why you can know all the facts and still feel wrecked. You can understand the psychology. You can understand their limitations. You can understand the timing was wrong, the bond was unstable, the person was avoidant, the situation was not good enough, the pattern was hurting you. You can know all of that and still wake up with your nervous system acting like something is unresolved. That used to confuse me so much. I would think, why am I still reacting if I already understand what this is? Why does my body still feel like it is waiting if my mind knows the truth? And what I eventually realized is that insight is not the same as closure. Insight helps. Insight matters. But closure lives lower than that. It lives in the body. It lives in the nervous system. It lives in whether your system still treats the connection like an open loop. That was one of the hardest things I had to admit to myself. I was not only attached to the person, my body was attached to the unfinished state, attached to the checking, the wondering, the hoping, the tiny spikes of contact, the fantasy of repair, the feeling that maybe it was not fully over because my body had never fully come down. So when I say closure without them, I do not mean pretending not to care. I mean learning how to let the body stop chasing what the bond never fully gave. One of the biggest mistakes I made was thinking closure would feel like certainty. I thought it would feel clean, final, strong. like some internal courtroom where the verdict finally came down and everything inside me settled immediately. But body closure was not like that for me at all. It was much stranger and much quieter. It looked more like this. The fantasy got weaker. The urgency got weaker. The checking felt less necessary. The idea of them stopped feeling like an active emergency. The story still hurt, but it stopped feeling like something I needed to solve right now. That is what changed first. Not my feelings. My nervous system's level of activation around the feelings. And that is a huge difference. Because people often think closure means the feelings disappear. That is usually not true. Sometimes the feelings stay for a while. What changes first is that the feelings stop running the system. They stop driving behavior. They stop creating constant urgency. They stop turning every memory into a live wire. So if you are waiting to feel nothing before you call it closure, you may wait much longer than you need to. The body often closes before the heart becomes completely neutral. Another thing I had to learn is that the body does not let go just because something was bad for you. This is where people get embarrassed by their own pain. They think, why am I still attached if I know it hurt me? But the body does not organize itself around logic that neatly. The body organizes around repetition, emotional intensity, hope, uncertainty, contrast, unfinished endings, and what it got trained to expect. So, if a bond had longing, relief, confusion, anticipation, intermittent contact, tenderness, and rupture, your body may still hold on to it even if your mind knows it was not healthy enough. That is not because the bond was meant to be. It is because your nervous system got conditioned inside it. And until I understood that, I kept making my lingering attachment mean something about destiny instead of something about conditioning. That cost me time. Because every time my body reacted, I thought it meant the bond was still alive in some special way. What it often meant was that my system had not fully metabolized the end. The first thing that actually helped me was understanding that closure is not the same thing as getting the perfect final conversation. This one hurt, because part of me still believed that if they could just explain it properly, acknowledge it properly, repair it properly, or finally say the emotionally correct thing, then my body would settle. But that belief kept me tied to them. It kept me making their participation the price of my peace. And that is a brutal place to live, because then your nervous system stays dependent on the exact person who is not giving you what you need. What I finally had to face was that even if I got the conversation, it might not do what I thought it would do. It might soothe me for a day. It might spike me again. It might reopen more hope. It might create another layer of pain. It might give me language, but not regulation. That was the hard truth. I was overvaluing explanation because explanation felt like a cleaner form of hope. But body closure needed something else. It needed repeated proof that I could survive the end without fresh contact. It needed my system to learn that nothing else was coming and that I could still become steady anyway. Another thing that mattered is that my body was not only attached to the person, it was attached to the state shifts, the anticipation, the message, the relief, the tension drop, the fantasy, the meaning, the checking, the almost. So, when the relationship ended, it was not just the person I was losing. I was losing an entire rhythm my nervous system had built itself around. That is why closure can feel so empty at first. Not because nothing is happening, because a whole internal activity set has stopped. And your body does not always know what to do with that empty space right away. It reaches back toward the old rhythm because the old rhythm even if painful, was familiar. That is why people mistake the ache of withdrawal for proof they should go back. Sometimes the ache is not guidance. Sometimes it is recalibration. Sometimes your system is grieving not only them, but the stimulation pattern around them. That matters because it changes how you interpret the pain. The second thing that helped me was letting the body tell the truth before my mind tried to turn it into a strategy. In the beginning, I kept trying to think my way out. I analyzed, I reframed, I understood, I explained. I built the theory. And all of that helped, but not in the way I thought it would. It helped me stop lying to myself, but it did not fully settle my system. What finally started helping was much less glamorous. I had to notice what the bond still did in my body, where I tensed, when I checked, what memories spiked me, what time of day I felt most hooked, what fantasies reopened me, what forms of access kept the bond emotionally alive. I had to stop treating my reactions like random pain and start treating them like body information. Not to obsess more, to get honest. Because closure in the body starts with honesty about what is still activated. If hearing their names still knocked the air out of me, that mattered. If checking my phone gave me a rush, that mattered. If imagining them with someone else made my body collapse, that mattered. If I still silently rehearsed future conversations, that mattered. If I still shaped my day around the possibility of hearing from them, that mattered. If I felt a spike every time I opened an app they used, that mattered. If a certain hour of the night still pulled me back into the bond, that mattered. Those were not reasons to feel ashamed. They were signs that the bond was still active in my nervous system. And once I stopped pretending I was more over it than I was, I could finally begin working with what was actually true. Another thing I learned is that body closure usually requires the end of micro-contact, not just major contact. A lot of people think they are trying to move on while they are still feeding the bond in tiny ways. Not always through direct messaging. Sometimes through checking, revisiting memories, stalking, rereading, interpreting, fantasizing, keeping symbolic objects charged, or mentally holding the person as unfinished. Those things matter because the body does not know the difference between physical contact and internally repeated reactivation as cleanly as people think. If you keep feeding the circuit stays active. That was one of the hardest things for me to admit. I wanted to believe I was just remembering, just checking, just wondering, just thinking. But sometimes I was maintaining the bond in my body by refusing to let the loop go quiet. Closure required less emotional feeding, less rehearsal, less symbolic contact, less treating the bond like it was still live just because my body still knew how to reach for it. It also required less bargaining, less, maybe this is the last time I will check, less, maybe this tiny thing means nothing, less, maybe I can look without reopening. I had to get honest that my nervous system was not neutral enough for those half measures. The third thing that helped me was allowing grief to feel ordinary instead of meaningful. This was huge, because at first, every wave of grief felt like proof that it mattered more, proof that it was unfinished, proof that the attachment was special, proof that I should not let go yet. But eventually I realized grief is not always a message to continue. Sometimes, grief is just what happens when the body is letting go of what it once organized itself around. That shift changed everything. Because the more I stopped using grief as evidence of destiny, the more grief could actually move. Before that, I kept turning every wave into meaning, and meaning kept the bond alive. Once I let the grief be ordinary, painful, human nervous system grief, it started passing through me differently. Still painful, still real, but less like a command, less like a prophecy, less like a reason to reopen the door. Another thing that mattered was learning the difference between feeling them and being hooked by them. This is subtle, but it changed a lot for me. There were times I could still feel them emotionally, still miss them, still be moved by memories, but the hook was weaker. And that was progress. Because the old pattern was not just feeling. The old pattern was feeling plus urgency, feeling plus checking, feeling plus fantasy, feeling plus internal chasing. So when the feelings stayed, but the urgency softened, that was not failure. That was closure beginning in the body. The body was learning how to feel without chasing, how to remember without reopening, how to ache without turning the ache into action. That matters because people often think closure should feel numb. But real closure is often much more alive than that. It just stops dragging you around. Another thing I had to understand is that body closure often needs repetition. Not one powerful decision, not one dramatic ritual. Repetition. Repeated non-contact. Repeated non-checking. Repeated toleration of the empty space. Repeated returning to myself when the mind drifted back. Repeated proof that I could survive evenings, mornings, weekends, and lonely moments without reopening the bond. That repetition is what taught my system something new. It taught my body that the ending could stay ended, and I could still live inside my life. At first, that felt impossible. Then it felt mechanical. Then, eventually, it felt less dramatic. That is the part people do not talk about enough. A lot of body closure is boring. It is not cinematic. It is repetitive. It is choosing not to feed the same circuit again and again until the circuit weakens. The fourth thing that helped me was recognizing that my body was confusing unfinished with important. This was one of the deepest traps for me, because the more unfinished it felt, the more significant it seemed. The more unanswered it was, the more powerful it felt. The more I did not understand it, the more my system treated it like something I needed to stay loyal to. But unfinished and important are not the same thing. A bond can remain unfinished because it never got what it needed to complete, not because it is meant to continue forever. That distinction saved me. Because once I saw that my body was overvaluing what stayed unresolved, I stopped automatically treating emotional charge as wisdom. Sometimes the body stays charged because the loop is still open, not because the person is still right for you. Sometimes the mind calls it special because the body still cannot settle. But settling and significance are not the same thing. Another thing that helped me was letting the image of them become smaller. This sounds simple, but it was not simple. Because when a bond stays alive in the nervous system, the person can become emotionally oversized. Their thoughts seem more powerful than your peace. Their attention seems more regulating than your own inner steadiness. Their absence seems more important than your actual life. I had to reverse that, not through force, through reality, through my own routines, through my own body, through my own relationships, through my own days, through my own emotional rhythm. Closure in the body got stronger when my actual life became bigger than my internal relationship to them. When my body had more places to live than just the old bond, it stopped treating them like the center of the entire emotional map. That did not happen overnight, but it mattered more than I realized. Another thing I learned is that you cannot shame your nervous system into letting go faster. I tried that too. I called myself pathetic in my head, dramatic, weak, embarrassing, still attached, still reactive. But shame did not create closure. Shame created more activation. It made the pain mean more. It made the process feel more urgent and more humiliating. What actually helped was something much kinder and much less dramatic. I started saying, "Of course this is hard. Of course my body is still holding some of this. Of course this is not instant." That softened the panic enough that release could actually start. Because the body lets go better in safety than in self-attack. Another thing that mattered was grieving the fantasy version separately from the actual relationship. This was huge. Sometimes what keeps the body hooked is not only what really happened, it is what almost happened, what should have happened, what you thought might finally happen, the version where they became ready, the version where they understood, the version where all the mixed signals turned into real consistency, the version where the bond became something your body could actually rest in. That fantasy can stay alive in the body long after reality has ended. And until I grieved the fantasy separately, the bond kept feeling alive, because part of me was not holding on to what was. Part of me was holding on to what it almost became. And that kind of grief is sneaky, because you are not only grieving a person, you are grieving a future your body started organizing around. Another thing that helped me was noticing what made the bond feel active again and refusing to romanticize those triggers. Certain songs, certain hours, certain types of loneliness, certain fantasies, certain social media behaviors, certain memories, certain emotional states. I had to get honest about what reopened the loop. Not to create paranoia, to stop pretending I was passive inside the process. Some forms of contact were external, yes, but some of the strongest reactivations were internal. The body learns through association. So if I kept pairing my lonely states with the memory of them, the body kept reattaching in those moments. Closure required interrupting those pairings often enough that the old emotional road got less automatic. Another thing I learned is that body closure often arrives before emotional certainty does. This mattered because I kept waiting to feel fully sure, fully done, fully resolved. But what started happening first was that the reactivity lowered, the checking urge lowered, the fantasy lost force, the internal spike lost strength. The body still cared, but it cared with less panic. That was closure starting. Not because everything was answered, because the body was no longer organizing itself around getting the answer. And that is a very different thing. Another thing that helped me was making peace with the fact that I might never get the ending that matched the depth of my feeling. That hurt. But it was liberating too. Because once I stopped demanding that reality give me an ending as emotionally complete as the attachment felt, I stopped waiting in the same way. I stopped bargaining for symmetry. Some endings are emotionally uneven. One person carries more. One person feels more unfinished. One person metabolizes it later. That is painful, but it is real. The body starts letting go faster when you stop making perfect symmetry the condition for peace. Another thing I learned is that sometimes body closure looks like boredom returning. This is a weird one, but it mattered. When the bond was active in my system, everything about it felt charged. Even silence felt charged. Even memory felt charged. Even not checking felt charged. Then, slowly, certain things just started feeling less emotionally important. Not meaningless, just less charged, less gripping, less alive. I did not feel triumphant when that happened. I mostly felt quiet. But that quiet mattered. It meant the body was no longer treating the bond like a current emergency. Another thing that helped me was giving my body new experiences of safety that had nothing to do with them. New rhythms, new places, new routines, new conversations, new emotional associations. Because if your whole body map is still organized around the old bond, letting go can feel like falling into blank space. The nervous system needs somewhere else to land. Closure got stronger when my body stopped treating them as the main place where meaning, regulation, and emotional charge lived. The more my life had real texture again, the less the old bond owned the center of my internal world. Another thing I learned is that sometimes closure in the body feels almost anticlimactic. You think it will arrive with some huge emotional finale, but sometimes it arrives quietly. You realize you have not checked in a while. You realize a thought of them passed through without rearranging your whole day. You realize a song did not hit the same. You realize your body did not brace the way it used to. You realize you can remember without reopening. And because those shifts are quiet, people sometimes miss them. They think closure has not happened because it did not arrive dramatically. But some of the deepest endings are quiet. They sound less like a speech and more like the nervous system finally getting tired of living on alert. Another thing I learned is that sometimes I had to stop asking whether I still loved them and start asking whether my body still expected them. That question helped me much more. Because love and expectation are not the same thing. You can still care about someone and no longer have your body organize around their possible return. That is a form of closure. You can still feel tenderness and no longer be waiting. You can still have memory and no longer have urgency. That distinction was so important for me because it made the process feel less all or nothing. I did not need to become cold to become free. I needed my body to stop expecting what reality was not giving. So let us bring it down clearly. Closure without them is possible, but it usually does not arrive as one final answer. It arrives when the body stops organizing itself around the bond. It arrives when the checking loses force, when the fantasy loses force, when the person stops feeling like an active emotional emergency, when the grief becomes grief instead of instruction, when you stop feeding the loop in tiny ways, when the empty space stops feeling like a problem you must solve, when your life starts feeling more real than the internal relationship, when your body finally learns that the ending can stay ended and you can still survive it. That is what finally helped me. Not the perfect final conversation. not the perfect explanation, not them doing it right. My body learning how to stop waiting. And if you are in that gap right now, where it ended in reality, but it still has not ended in your body, I want you to hear me clearly. That does not mean you are failing. It does not mean the bond is destined. It does not mean you need more contact to complete it. Sometimes, it just means your nervous system is still finishing something your mind already knows. And that process can still be painful, but it is not hopeless. The body can learn to let it end too. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.